Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Understanding Ethics with the Council of Algorithms. In our last episode, we explored several of the major ethical frameworks that people use to reason about right and wrong. We looked at perspectives like virtue ethics, care ethics, rule based ethics, and relational ethics. Those frameworks answer a broad question: what ultimately matters? But today, we're looking at something a little different. Today's topic isn't what people value, it's how they apply those values when making difficult decisions. Two people may share nearly identical values and still reach completely different conclusions because they approach moral rules differently. Some people believe rules should never be broken. Others believe exceptions exist, but only rarely. Others may think that every situation should be judged independently, and there are some who believe morality is largely personal and subjective. These aren't different moral goals, they're different decision making lenses, and understanding these lenses can explain many disagreements that otherwise seem impossible to reconcile. So, before we begin, it's important to distinguish between an ethical framework and a decision making lens. Think of ethics like planning a journey. Your ethical framework determines your destination. Your decision making lens determines how you navigate the road. Two travelers may both want to reach the same place. One follows the GPS exactly, another takes occasional detours. Someone else might constantly adapt to traffic patterns, while one simply trusts their instincts. They share the same goal, but both navigate differently. Likewise, two people who both deeply value compassion may disagree about whether lying is ever acceptable. The disagreement isn't about compassion, it's about how moral rules should be applied. Before we explore these four lenses, it's worth briefly mentioning where this model comes from. In 1980, psychologist Donaldson R. Forsyth introduced what became known as the Ethics Position Questionnaire, or EPQ. Rather than asking which ethical philosophy people believed, Forsyth studied how people tended to make moral judgments. His research suggested that ethical reasoning often varies along two broad dimensions: idealism, the extent to which someone believes ethical actions should avoid causing harm and should lead to positive outcomes whenever possible, and relativism, the extent to which someone believes moral rules and universal are, that moral rules are universal versus dependent on the specific situation or context. So, by combining these two dimensions, Forsyth identified four common ethical positions. So, although the names are used in academic research differ somewhat from the decision making lenses used in the series, the underlying ideas overlap considerably, and they've become influential in psychology, ethics, and organizational research. Our goal today isn't to examine Forsyth's models in detail, but to use these four decision making lenses as practical tools for recognizing different patterns of moral reasoning. Like most models in ethics and psychology, they aren't meant to place people into rigid boxes. Instead, they help us better understand why thoughtful people can approach the same moral problem in very different ways. So let's explore these four common approaches. The first we're going to be looking at is absolutist ethics. This view believes certain moral rules are always binding. Ethical decisions are evaluated based on whether they align with universal moral standards. So an absolutist believes that these principles are always binding. Some actions are simply right or wrong. These truths don't change because circumstances become difficult. An absolutist might say justice should remain justice, Truth is truth. Innocent people should never be intentionally harmed. So, the strength of this approach is consistency. Everyone knows where the moral boundaries are, and rules don't bend simply because they're inconvenient. History offers many examples of people admired precisely because they refused to compromise deeply held principles, even under tremendous pressure. But absolutism also raises difficult questions. Suppose lying could save someone's life. Should you lie? An absolutist may answer no. Another may argue that protecting innocent life is itself the higher absolute. So even within absolutism, people sometimes disagree, not because they reject absolute morality, but because they prioritize different moral principles. And that highlights something very important. Even seemingly rigid systems still require interpretation. Our next lens is exceptionist ethics. These generally follow moral rules, but allows more limited exceptions under extreme or justified conditions. So, in fact, they often agree with absolutists most of the time. The difference appears when extraordinary situations arise. Exceptionists ask, is this one of those rare moments where breaking the rules actually preserves the deeper moral purpose behind it? So imagine our emergency responders breaking traffic laws to save someone's life, or a doctor withholding devastating information for a few minutes until a patient is medically stable, or lying to protect someone hiding from violence. An exceptionist sees these not as abandoning morality, but as carefully balancing competing moral obligations. Rules remain valuable, exceptions remain rare. And that's an important distinction. Exceptionism is not anything goes. It isn't abandoning principles whenever they're inconvenient. Instead, it argues that unusual circumstances sometimes create genuine moral conflicts where following one rule would violate another equally important value. The challenge, of course, is deciding where exceptions stop. If exceptions become too common, are they still exceptions? Our next moral lens is situationist ethics. This view rejects strict rules as the primary guidance. Ethical decisions instead depend heavily on the context, outcomes, and situational judgment. Situationism takes a much more flexible approach. So rather than beginning with rules, situationists begin with the situation itself. Every circumstance is unique. Every relationship is different. Every decision carries different consequences. Instead of asking what rule applies, they ask what action best serves this situation. Suppose a school has a strict attendance policy. A student misses class repeatedly. A rule based system may immediately apply punishment. A situationist asks additional questions. Was the student caring for a sick parent? Were they homeless? Did transportation fail? Did they simply choose not to attend? The same behavior, but potentially very different moral judgments in each of these situations. Situationists argue that rigid rules sometimes create injustice precisely because they ignore important context. Their strength is flexibility. Their challenge is consistency. If every situation is different, how do we ensure people are treated fairly? Where do we draw the line between thoughtful judgment and arbitrary decision making? Our final ethical lens is subjectivist ethics. In this view, ethical judgments are based primarily on individual perception, emotion, or personal interpretation, rather than external rules or universal standards. This final lens is perhaps the most controversial. Rather than appealing to universal rules or objective moral standards, subjectivists emphasize personal interpretation. Different people genuinely experience the world differently. Culture matters. Life experiences are different, and emotions might be different from person to person, and everyone has a unique individual identity. So, what feels deeply wrong to one person may not feel the same to another. This perspective reminds us that human beings don't make decisions like computers. We interpret our surroundings. We feel different emotions. We empathize with others who might be hurting, and we struggle with complex decisions. Subjectivism encourages humility. It reminds us that our own perspective isn't the only perspective, but it also raises difficult philosophical questions. If morality is entirely subjective, can anything truly be called wrong? How do we resolve disagreements? Can society function without shared moral standards? These questions have been debated by philosophers for centuries. So let's compare the four lenses. We'll imagine a simple scenario. A journalist receives classified documents exposing government corruption. Publishing them could reveal illegal conduct, but publication also compromises national security. How might each lens approach this decision? An absolutist might ask, what moral rule is highest? If honesty and public accountability are absolute duties, publication may be required. If protecting innocent lives is the higher duty, withholding information may become the obligation. An exceptionist, however, might begin with rules protecting confidential information, but conclude that this is an extraordinary circumstance where exposing corruption justifies an exception. A situationist would carefully examine all the circumstances: who's affected, what harms may occur, what alternatives exist, what outcome best serves justice in this specific case. A subjectivist, on the other hand, may place significant weight on personal conscience. What feels morally responsible to the individual making the decision? Notice something interesting? Each person may support publication or oppose publication for entirely different reasons. Again, ethics often isn't disagreement over facts, it's disagreement over how moral reasoning should work. So these decision making styles influence nearly every area of society. Judges often wrestle with balancing legal consistency against unique circumstances. Doctors regularly face situations where competing ethical obligations collide. Teachers decide whether classroom rules should always be enforced or whether individual context matters. Parents constantly choose between consistency and flexibility. Managers determine whether company policy should apply equally to everyone or adapt to individual situations. Even in our personal lives, we make these decisions almost every day. Should I keep my promise? Should I make an exception? Should I consider this other person's circumstances? Should I trust my own moral intuition? Recognizing these lenses help us understand not only other people, but also ourselves. These lenses also aren't always mutually exclusive. Most people don't entirely live inside one category or another. Someone may generally be an absolutist while allowing extremely rare exceptions. Someone may usually think situationally while believing certain human rights should never be violated. In reality, most people's ethical reasoning is more nuanced than neat philosophical boxes. These categories aren't labels to place people into, they're tools for understanding patterns of reasoning. They're maps. not prisons. If you've watched the council debates, you may already recognize these different lenses at work. Some council members begin with principles. Others begin with relationships. Some emphasize outcomes, and others may emphasize personal experiences. Sometimes two members value exactly the same thing, yet completely disagree about how to apply it. As you continue watching future debates, I encourage you to ask yourself two questions. First, what values are they trying to protect? And second, how are they deciding what to do? These are often two separate questions. Understanding both reveals much deeper conversations than simply asking who is right. So today, we've looked at 4 different ways people approach moral decisions. Absolutists seek consistency through universal moral rules. Exceptionists preserve those rules while recognizing rare, justified exceptions. Situationists prioritize context over rigid application. And subjectivists emphasize personal interpretation, lived experience, and individual moral understanding. Each lens offers valuable insights. Each also faces difficult questions, and those questions become even more interesting when combined with the ethical frameworks we discussed in our previous episode. Next time, we'll begin diving deeper into different ethical traditions and examine how history, philosophy, and psychology have shaped the moral ideas that still influence us today. Ethics is rarely as simple as asking whether someone followed the rules. The deeper question is, how did they decide what the rules required in the first place? The more we understand these different approaches to moral reasoning, the better prepared we become to navigate disagreement with curiosity instead of frustration. Because ethical thinking is not about reaching the right conclusion, it's about understanding the path that leads you there. Thank you for watching, and until next time, remember, with perspective comes understanding.